premonition of the Khe Sanh nightmare. In January 1968, U.S. Marines stationed at Khe Sanh could feel that something terrible was about to happen. Unusual signs grew more frequent. North Vietnamese Army (NVA) activity around the base intensified, and an eerie, oppressive atmosphere settled over the area. Strange sounds echoed from the surrounding jungle, sending chills down the spines of the soldiers. Anxiety mounted as patrols were suspended, the base gates were sealed, and the situation became increasingly dire. A few days later, from a ridge approximately 500 meters from the base, American troops spotted a group of North Vietnamese soldiers. Without hesitation, they called in 105mm artillery fire to eliminate the target. When a reconnaissance team moved in to inspect the area, they found bloodstains and drag marks leading westward. However, orders from command instructed them to withdraw rather than pursue the enemy. This decision left the Marines uneasy and on high alert. Tensions escalated further when a North Vietnamese officer unexpectedly appeared before the base, holding a white cloth. He issued a chilling warning: at exactly midnight, Hill 861 and Hill 881 would come under attack, and by dawn the main base would face an all-out assault. Faced with this ominous message, the entire U.S. Marine garrison went into full combat readiness, bracing themselves for the nightmare that was about to unfold. The terrifying attack that marked the beginning of the Siege of Khe Sanh. On the night of January 20th and into the early hours of January 21, 1968, as darkness enveloped Khe Sanh, U.S. Marines tensely awaited the attack foretold in the ominous warning. In the thick, oppressive night, eerie, ghostly chuckles suddenly echoed from beyond the perimeter fence. North Vietnamese soldiers were silently cutting through the barbed wire, preparing for an all-out assault. Moments later, a green flare shot up into the sky, the signal to commence the attack. In an instant, the battlefield erupted into an inferno of relentless gunfire and explosions. Nearly 20,000 North Vietnamese troops launched a full-scale offensive against the base, which was defended by 6,000 U.S. Marines and a contingent of South Vietnamese forces. The siege had officially begun. Khe Sanh was positioned in the rugged mountains near the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a vital supply route for the North Vietnamese. The United States had established the base to disrupt this critical lifeline, but the North Vietnamese were determined to eliminate the American presence. On the first night, the 304th Division of the People's Army of Vietnam, NVA, initiated the battle with a devastating artillery barrage, destroying defensive positions and inflicting severe damage. A direct hit on an American ammunition depot triggered a massive explosion, dealing significant losses within the base. U.S. artillery responded immediately, but the situation grew increasingly dire. An American artilleryman, Dennis Manion, later recounted a chilling moment as he moved through the pitch-black trenches, armed only with a sidearm. Suddenly, his hand brushed against the hair of a North Vietnamese soldier right inside the trench. Reacting instinctively, he drew his pistol and shot the enemy before continuing his mission to direct artillery fire. As the brutal night of combat wore on, dawn finally broke, yet the battle showed no signs of abating. U.S. troops discovered around 30 North Vietnamese bodies strewn across the barbed wire, along with signs indicating that many wounded soldiers had been dragged away. As the sun rose, another wave of artillery fire rained down upon the base, signaling that the nightmare of the prolonged siege had only just begun for the Marines at Khe Sanh. The harsh life under a 77-day siege. Following the initial brutal assault, North Vietnamese forces maintained a relentless siege on Khe Sanh, bombarding the base with artillery fire and trapping the U.S. Marines in an increasingly dire situation. With no way to leave the base or receive direct reinforcements, they were forced to endure 77 grueling days under extreme conditions. Life took place entirely within trenches and cramped bunkers. Nothing on the surface could survive the constant barrage of artillery shells. The air was thick with the stench of gunpowder, blood, and decaying bodies that had yet to be recovered. With no means to properly bury the dead, corpses were left exposed, becoming a gruesome feast for swarms of rats in the humid, sweltering climate. The scene evoked haunting images of the brutal trench warfare of World War I. For over 2 months, the Marines lived in filthy, tattered uniforms. Many suffered from the psychological and physical effects of relentless artillery blasts, experiencing concussive trauma despite not being directly wounded. Some bled from their noses and ears due to the sheer force of the explosions, while exhaustion set in from the lack of water, food, and sleep. On average, around 1,000 artillery shells rained down on the base daily, denying them even a moment of respite. With the airstrip heavily damaged, supply planes could no longer land. Instead, food, ammunition, and drinking water were airdropped into the base. However, the drop zones lay just outside the main defensive perimeter, making them prime targets for North Vietnamese fire. The moment the supplies hit the ground, a torrent of artillery shells followed, resulting in heavy casualties. Despite the deadly risk, Marines had no choice but to sprint into the open, scrambling to retrieve essential supplies in a desperate bid for survival. Meanwhile, medevac helicopters attempting to evacuate the wounded faced relentless enemy fire. Some were shot down before they could even land. Severely injured soldiers often succumbed before they could be evacuated, leading to an ever-rising death toll. Amid the hellscape of Khe Sanh, life became more fragile than ever. Each passing day was not just a battle against the enemy but a relentless fight against death itself. Operation Pegasus, the effort to break the Siege of Khe Sanh. After months of relentless siege and heavy bombardment by North Vietnamese forces, the situation at Khe Sanh had become more critical than ever. U.S. Marine casualties continued to rise, while supplies dwindled to dangerously low levels. With the base at risk of being completely overrun, U.S. Command decided to launch Operation Pegasus, a mission to break the siege and rescue the trapped Marines. Operation Pegasus commenced in March 1968, spearheaded by the 1st Cavalry Division Airmobile, one of the most elite units in the U.S. Army. The rescue plan combined airborne assaults, artillery strikes, and ground offensives to eliminate North Vietnamese strongholds around Khe Sanh while reopening Route 9, the critical supply route connecting the base to the rest of South Vietnam. U.S. airstrikes, including devastating B-52 carpet bombings, targeted North Vietnamese positions, creating a firewall to ease pressure on the Marines. Meanwhile, ground forces launched fierce assaults to reclaim the surrounding hills, where the North Vietnamese had dug an extensive trench system to control the high ground. Brutal fighting ensued as enemy troops fiercely resisted using ambush tactics, fortified bunkers, and underground tunnels to counter the advancing American forces. Under pressure from multiple directions, North Vietnamese forces gradually weakened and were forced to retreat. With the supply lines reopened, U.S. forces could finally deliver reinforcements, food, and ammunition to the besieged Marines. By June 1968, after more than 2 months of intense combat, U.S. Command decided to withdraw from Khe Sanh to avoid being drawn into a war of attrition that favored the enemy. The withdrawal was executed carefully, beginning with the evacuation of the wounded and essential equipment. Most of the base's infrastructure was intentionally destroyed to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. On the night of July 11, 1968, the last American troops departed from Khe Sanh, marking the end of the 77-day siege, one of the most grueling and intense battles in modern military history. The bloody aftermath of the Battle of Khe Sanh. After enduring more than 2 months of relentless siege, U.S. forces decided to withdraw from Khe Sanh in June 1968. The withdrawal was carried out in phases, starting with the evacuation of the wounded and the removal of critical equipment. To prevent the North Vietnamese from occupying and repurposing the base, most of its infrastructure was deliberately destroyed. By July 11, 1968, the last U.S. Marines had left Khe Sanh, officially bringing the 77-day siege to an end. The battle left heavy casualties on both sides. The U.S. suffered approximately 300 dead and 3,000 wounded, while North Vietnamese forces endured far greater losses, with an estimated 15,000 soldiers killed. This was one of the bloodiest and most brutal sieges in modern warfare, rivaling the infamous trench battles of World War I in sheer intensity and devastation. Throughout the 77-day ordeal, U.S. Marines fought under extreme conditions. With no way to leave the base, they survived on limited supplies airdropped by helicopters and cargo planes while enduring constant artillery bombardments and ground assaults from the North Vietnamese. The battlefield became a living nightmare, with unburied corpses left in the open, trenches overrun with mud, rats, and filth, and soldiers struggling to find clean water. Even as U.S. airstrikes devastated North Vietnamese positions, they also reduced Khe Sanh to ruins, leaving nothing but a scarred landscape of craters and debris. Although the U.S. declared Khe Sanh a strategic victory, as the North Vietnamese had failed to seize the base, the subsequent withdrawal raised serious doubts. Critics questioned whether holding the base had been worth the heavy losses, and whether the battle had been a diversion to draw U.S. forces away from the Tet Offensive, which had erupted across South Vietnam at the same time. Ultimately, the Siege of Khe Sanh marked a turning point. It demonstrated the North Vietnamese Army's ability to execute prolonged siege warfare, wearing down a technologically superior force through attrition and encirclement tactics. More importantly, the battle was a crucial step in the larger 1968 offensive, helping to shift the momentum of the war and further undermining U.S. confidence in achieving victory in Vietnam.